So far we've talked about writing quadratic functions, we've talked about converting quadratic functions into different forms, we've talked about graphing quadratic functions. Learning Target 11 is all about solving quadratic functions, which means to find the solution or the x-intercepts to the quadratic function. Now, in order to solve using the zero product property, which is one of them that we're going to look at today, you're going to turn to the bottom of the page with Learning Target 11 on it. And the zero product property is something that you use when the function is in factored form. So if it looks like this, which is factored form, then you can use the zero product property, because this is really just x plus 0 for that first factor. So the things you need to think about and know is that, first of all, anything times 0 equals 0. So we remember that from learning our multiplication facts in elementary school. And we also need to know that the solution to a quadratic function happens when the function equals 0, when y is 0 or f of x is 0. So when y or f of x equals 0. Because they happen at the x-intercepts, and we know that each intercept happens when the other variable is 0. So the x-intercepts happen when y is 0, which means the solutions happen when y is 0. So when either factor of a quadratic function is 0, when it's in factored form, so like if that equals 0, then 0 times whatever that is will be 0. So f of x will equal 0, and that will be a solution, because the solutions happen when f of x equals 0. So when either factor of a quadratic function is 0, the whole function equals 0, or f of x equals 0. We'll put that right there. F of x equals 0. So that means that any number that makes either factor equal to 0 is a solution. So we know that, for example, in this one, if we take x plus 3 and we set it equal to 0, we know that if we solve that, we're going to get negative 3. So that's a solution to that function, because when we plug in negative 3 plus 3 is 0. 0 times, doesn't matter what this is, because 0 times anything is 0. So if this is 0, the whole thing is 0, which means that the function, the f of x equals 0 at that point, which means that's an x-intercept, so it's a solution. We can also think about this second factor. If we take that and we figure out what x has to be here to make that equal to 0, we know that if we add 1 to both sides, x equals 1. So also, if x is 1, this factor is 0, which means 0 times whatever that is going to be 0. So f of x is 0 when x is 1, which means that that's an x-intercept, because x-intercepts happen when when y is 0. So basically, the summary of that is that whatever numbers make either of these factors 0, so in this case, negative 3 and a positive 1, those are going to be the solutions to the function. So if you were to graph this function, it would cross the x-axis at negative 3 and a positive 1. Over here, let's think about what makes this factor equal to 0. So if we cannot do that in our head, over here it's a little bit easier to do these in your head, because you could just think, oh, well, 1 minus 1 is 0, so x is 1. But this is a little bit trickier, so we can just set that factor equal to 0, subtract 4 from both sides, so we get 2x equals negative 4. Divide by 2. So x is negative 2. So we know that if x is negative 2, then this factor equals 0. So the whole thing is 0, so that's a solution. And then over here, if you set that factor equal to 0, then you solve for x, you end up with x being a positive 3. And again, you could just do that in your head. You wouldn't even need to show your work on this, I don't think, unless you need to. You're welcome to show your work, but you don't have to if you can do that part in your head. So that means that if you were to graph this function, it would cross the x-axis at negative 2 and a positive 3, because those are the two numbers that would make each of these factors equal to 0. This last one, this factor, if you set it equal to 0, you already have your answer. If x is 0, then that's 0. So that would be a solution, because if that's 0, 0 times whatever that is going to be 0. So y would be 0, and that would be an x-intercept. And then over here, if you subtract 5 from both sides, x is negative 5. So that's a 0. Or that's a, well, it's a 0 in its solution. So if x is 0, or if x is negative 5, that means that if you were to graph this, this graph would cross the x-axis at 0 and negative 5. So those are solutions.